to our hearing on measures to tackle under-occupation. Each deputation or individual will be allowed 3 minutes to speak. And I'd like to remind you that your submissions will not be protected by the Legislative Powers and Privileges Ordinance. I also like to draw attention to the the guidelines to members of the public attending hearings in this council. The guidelines would stipulate all the public security measures, and it's also table for the deputations. You're also welcome to obtain a copy of the guideline from our security staff. We also have simultaneous interpretation service. Channel 0 is the floor channel, Channel 1 is Cantonese, Channel 2 is English, and Channel 3 is the Putonghua channel. In attendance today, I will introduce the officials. They are Mr. Albert Lee, Deputy Director of Housing, Mr. Leung Sai Chi, Assistant Director, Estate Management, Mr. Virgil Shu, Chief Manager, and Mr. Lui Kwok Wai, Chief Manager of the Housing Department. We're now into the second round of discussion, and we will start with the concern group for the tenants who were transferred out of Chin Wan, Kwai Chung, and Ching Yi. I think one cannot speculate on essential necessities like if they were put to speculation, it would create a lot of social instability. The government has the obligation to enable the public to have access to all these necessities and basic facilities. For example, the Link and the West Rail should not be speculated because they affect public livelihood. They are the rights of the residents, and they're not actually giveaways or welfare. Housing is actually a basic facility and the right of every member of the community. It should not be used for speculation. Some deputations saying that the total number of vacant units in the private market equals the total number of households. In other words, we actually have sufficient number of residential units, but many of them are being hoarded for speculation. As a result, some people who have housing needs don't have accommodation, and other people, while other units are left vacant. Could you come back to the topic of under-occupation? I'm exactly going to go into this topic. Exactly, it's because of these phenomenon that have an impact on under-occupation. The government should impose a tax on vacant premises, and we should cut down on the production of luxury apartments and increase the production of PRH units. Only then can we make good use of public resources. Whether or not it's people living in subdivided flats or industrial buildings or factory buildings, and the well-off tenants in PRH estates, they're all victims of property speculation. I do not want those who are on the PRH waiting list to end up like ourselves. That is, whenever there is a slight change in a household, we will be forced to transfer. Starting from 2007, the Housing Department, in enforcing its policy on under-occupation, has been changing the goalposts all the time while refusing to admit it. Kai Fong from different districts had asked the Housing Department in June last year, and they were told they need not be transferred before they would decorate the units or remove some of the family members from the list. And a few months later, they received a letter from the Housing Department telling them that they've been put onto the PUO list. So senior management of the Housing Department, in enforcing the under-occupation policy, has been moving the goalpost, and the frontline staff didn't even know about it. Also, the size of the government the Housing Department is tightening the space allocation. It's really inhuman. To tackle the housing problem, we need to build more spacious PRH units. At the moment, I think the ratio of land allocation is wrong. Previously, we have 40% private housing, 6% PRH. Your time is up. I'm sorry. I think your time is up. I think it should be 80% PRH and 20% private property. Next, we have Ms. Wong Lai Ming, concerned group for tenants transferred out of石籬. My family had to be moved to a different unit a year ago. We are not on the PUO list, and last year suddenly we are put on the PUO list. We don't know why the policy has changed in the course of 3 years. That's because our public housing policy is actually changing for the worse all the time. According to common sense, a progressive policy should allow people to have more living space, and the government therefore should not tighten the criteria, if not relaxing it. But the housing department is moving the goalposts all the time, and is tightening the standard every year, and creating these under occupation households in order to increase the supply of PRH units, and that is putting the cart before the horse. After they move the goalposts, they would label the PUO units as occupying more space than they should, and then they play with the figures, and they try to hide the fact that they're not increasing this PRX unit supply, and saying that it is right to take back these units occupied by the PUO households, but in reserving units for the PUO households, and as a result, there is competition with the single persons applying for PRH. So I don't know whether the government is trying to create a problem or solve a problem. Last year, in the policy address, the CE said that the 1/3 of housing supply will rely on the total number of PRH units could be recover is 7,000. The housing department said that they would conduct a review, and the number of PUO units will be increased to 7,500. Why don't you simply tell us how many units you can recover? So the problem of insufficient, housing supply is because the government is not building. The PUO policy will adversely affect all the PRH units. If we don't stand up, then the housing department will continue to tell lies and fool the public. If we allow them to move the goalposts, more and more PRH tenants will be affected. They will all be living in fear and panic. Our housing department will face a reality, increase the supply of PRH units to tackle the problem, and also immediately cancel the policy in respect of under occupation. Next, we have the concerned group from the Onyam Estate. Thank you. My name is Mai. Beg your pardon. The Housing Authority has released some figures which are very hard to understand. For most of the PUO households, normally it's because they become PUO units because some members have passed away, and the housing department is saying that they now want to take back the units so that they can be allocated to households with a larger size, such as a 3 to 4 or 5 or 6 member household. But if for a single household, if only one person has died, why is it that the unit could now be used to accommodate so many more people? Is it because the person who died has taken up exceptionally more space than other people, or is it because the new people household moving in are so small in stature that the unit can accommodate so many people? As the lady said just now, our living environment has actually gone down. Is it because the housing department has overestimated the effectiveness of the PUO policy, or just because to smear the so-called over-occupation households so the public is misled as to believe that they are taking up unreasonably spacious unit? And the housing department is saying that this policy can help you make effective use of resources. However, are we talking about effective use of housing department's resources or social resources? The under-occupation policy constantly require PRH tenants to move out, be transferred. If someone in the family dies, they have to move. If a member, give birth to a child and so on, they have to move again. And after if they need to move, the expenses they've incurred in fitting out the units and the furniture they've acquired will become useless. The furniture will be taken to the landfills, and that will take up the resources of landfills. for the PO units, if they are transferred, they have to rely on the savings or even borrow from other people to help them move. And when they get old, they can't make ends meet. So what do? They apply for CSSA. Again, that would add to the burden, and again, more public resources will be required. The housing department say that they would they would take care of 7,000 PO households. But they've not told us how much rubbish will be created, how much social expenditure will need to go up, and how much of other social resources will be required. So how can we, the public, objectively say that this is a policy that can help the government make effective use of resources? Finally, I'd like to appeal to the Housing Department to scrap the policy on under-occupation. Don't play with the figures. You don't, victimize the tenants of PRH units. Next, we have the concerned group representing the Sau Mau Ping residents. Ms. Wong, Chairman, I was also forced to be transferred to a different unit because of the housing blocks built with defective concrete. I used to live in Sau Mau Ping on a 16th floor block, and the housing department tried very hard to persuade us to move to the one-bedroom unit in the Harmony block, and verbally promised me that even if my mother were to pass away, I wouldn't be asked to leave the unit. But now the government is changing the policy, the housing department is changing its policy. We are already at the lowest strata of our society. We simply don't have the means, we don't have the saving to allow us to move, from one unit to another. We can barely make ends meet. And the housing department is using our resources to solve their problem, because the cost of relocation is not a small sum. Even if you were to fit out simply the unit you are transferred to, it will cost you several tens of thousands of dollars, and your subsidy is only $4,000. And the furniture which have previously been bought have to be given away. Now that I've moved to Kai Ching Estate, I don't even have space to accommodate a pot or a frying pan. They have to put place next to my bed, and I dare not even invite my friends to visit, because my flat is, filled with, all kinds of things. And all the units that you're now building, the standard is even worse than they were before the time when I lived in the old 16th floor block. Externally, Kai Ching Estate look very nice, but if you move in and live there, you'll find that there would be many problems. The kitchen is so small, the design is so defective, and once you enter the floor, and it will only take 4 steps for you to reach your bed. There's simply no space to live. It's like a hostel where people only go back to the unit to sleep in the evening. So your housing policy and the quality of units that you build are now deteriorating. So you can't blame the Singaporeans and other people who are saying that questioning why our housing policy is so defective in Hong Kong. 3 months ago, I handed a letter to your chairman, Mr. Wong. I told the housing department I don't have the means to be transferred, but they forcibly asked me to move out because they were giving me a fourth offer. So I was forced to take out a loan from the bank and spend several tens of thousands of dollars to fill out the new unit. So what I'd like to ask is, this policy is actually victimizing the poorest, strata of our society. If we have the means, if we can afford to take out $100,000 at any time, we don't even need to live in PRH units at all. Your policy simply is not humane. You only focus on the figures. You just forcibly make us move out of the unit and be transferred to a smaller unit.
Well, we have 250,000 on the waiting list, and some 150,000 are from general households, and public housing is a very precious type of resources. That's why we are in favor of allocating the larger units to the larger households. But then we are of the view that in protecting and safeguarding the appropriate use of public resources, in the enforcement of public housing policy, we also have to take into account the needs of the tenants in order to minimize the negative impact. We have 3 suggestions. Number 1, in defining what's meant by PUO, the elderly tenants' needs should be taken into account cautiously. Under the latest arrangement for families with elderly household members and disabled members, they would be put to the back of the list. But then for those who are under 70, they would be put to the back. But then there are many who are in the range of 60 to 69. They are very worried about this. But then under the current policy relating to elderly tenants, usually they would take 60 as a threshold. We urge that for people over 60, they should be taken out of the PUO list so that that would become more consistent with the existing housing policy. And also in relocating the PUO households, they should be relocated to units within the same district or estate as far as possible, so that these households do not have to be removed from their original community and adapt to a new community. And if they have to move to a new district or new estate, they will find it difficult to adapt. And many households would also have young family members who might have to go to different schools, and they would also have to find a new job. So as far as possible, they should be rehoused in situ. That's the overriding principle of the policy. And thirdly, for special circumstances, they should be taken into account. For some households, they would have difficulty and hardship in a course of removal. So the housing department should consider this. For example, for some households who might be getting married very shortly, or there might be new members joining the family shortly, and yet under the existing policy, they may have to move several times, and it's very disturbing. Therefore, the administration or the housing department should offer more assistance to these households with hardship, so that they would not be inconvenienced because of the rigidity of the system. Next, Chengyi Communal Housing Concern Group, Ms. Wong Ho Man. Thank you, Chairman. As the policy has been tightening up the definition of PUO households, more and more people are affected. Earlier on, I also tried to read audit report number 68. The audit director said that the units should be allocated to those on the waiting list, and that should be the priority. But then Mr. Liu, the housing department chief, also told us that the housing department will have to reserve some 1,000 units every year in order to tie in with the policy on PUO households. So, with the addition of 1 and then the deduction of 1, so I'm offering you a smaller unit in exchange for a larger unit. In fact, there will be no change in the number of units at all. And yet, there will be more people scrambling for these units. For us, public housing tenants, these units are not just a unit. It's our family. It's a home. So it's a place for us to rest, whether it's for us to rest mentally or physically. So it's our home. And therefore, we would put in a lot of our feelings and sentiments there. But then all of a sudden, if a family member passes away, or if a member has to leave the household, then we will then become a PUO household. That will also add to the stress of the household in question. So for us ordinary citizens, we would have expected that after a day's work, we would be able to go home and take a break. And yet this all of a sudden has become a source of stress. Or I know of a household, and he's an elderly household. He's age 65, but then under the latest housing policy, he would only be defined as an exempted case after he has reached 70. But then he has become a PUO household because his wife has passed away, and now you are forcing him to move. But then he has no family member at all. The closest people to him would be his neighbors, and then for relatives, they are living too far away from him, so he has to rely heavily on his neighbors. And now you're asking him to move to a different place. Well, honestly, for an elderly tenant, how long can he live? So after he has passed away, he will be surrendering his unit to the housing department anyway. So do you really want to see all of them die before they are transferred? Next, Mr. Chen Nam from the Kwai Ching Concern Group. Thank you. Our concern group constitutes young people mostly. But then the reason why we have formed this concern group, because we are very concerned about housing issue. And many of us live in Tung Chung, Tin Shui Wai. These are new towns, and I'm sure you are aware of that. Well, back then, the housing department told us that you'd be allocated a flat, and we know that you are the you are moving into these new towns and these are new flats and so on. And then after we have moved in, you then tell us that all right, we have to apply the latest housing policy, and then you say that, well, for young people, well, we'll be relaxing the rules, and then for singletons, you'll be given additional scores and so on. But how about us young people? Well, for those of us pursuing a degree, all right, we have to pay tuition fees, and then after we have graduated, we also have to repay our debts, and therefore we can only wait for public rental housing. But then you are actually classifying some of us as PUO cases, and then you tell us that you will have to wait for a bit longer because there are people occupying these over or bigger flats. So you're actually pitching one against another. Well, as we all know, well, even if you move them to a smaller flat, there will be no increase in the number of flats at all. There will not be any, so it's a one-for-one situation. Well, housing is the basic responsibility of the government, and apparently you don't think that's the government's duty, and you're trying to stir up conflicts within the community. And then for the uneven distribution of public housing resources, you're putting the blame on the PUO households. And you say that, well, you have fewer people in a household now, and therefore you should be moving to a smaller flat. But then, what if they get married? Are you going to give them a bigger flat then? And for how long do they have to wait? Nobody can tell. All right, put yourselves in our shoes. All right, of course, you senior officials are not going to stay in public housing flats, but what if your relatives or friends live in public housing estates? What if they get married? Will you be happy for them? All right. For people from 60 to 69, they will be put to the back of the queue, and therefore they need not worry. But then, why don't you just say that for people at or above 70, they will not be affected? So you have discretionary power, but then I don't see how you're going to exercise that power. Next, concern group on evicted public housing tenants, Mr. Lai. Yes, we are representing the evicted tenants of public housing, and in the name of effective use of public housing resources, the administration is now tightening up the policy, and you're actually forcibly evicting households and tenants. Well, if they do not accept your offer, then they will have to be evicted. So I'd like to say this. Well, in the latest document submitted to the LegCo, you said that well, because of the deletion of household members, and if they are exceeding the standards for tenants in these flats, then they will be classified as PUO households. In fact, well, in many cases, the household size has shrunken because of the passing away of a family member, and yet you are putting the blame on these households, and that would incur loss on their part. Well, the administration said that well, since 1992, you have already adopted this policy, but then in terms of redevelopment, in dealing with Tin Shui Wai and Tung Chung, you have deliberately been more generous than the normal standard. Well, since 2007, you can claim that because of the audit report, you are asking people to leave. In fact, the assistant director, in his response to the audit report, he also admitted that if you tighten up the policy, well, there will only be more people on the waiting list, and therefore you are contradicting yourself. On the one hand, you are recovering the larger units so that you'll be able to reassign or allocate a smaller unit to us. But then there are many people out there waiting for smaller units. As the Assistant Director admitted, every year you have to reserve 1,000 smaller units for these so-called PUO households. So how come these 1,000 units cannot be allocated to those on the waiting list? In doing so, you will actually be able to speed up the allocation process. And you have not really put up more units for allocation. And if you look at the figures provided there by the administration, it's misleading. You said that there are some 50,000 PUO households there. In fact, that's not true. The reason why the figure has been rising, that's because you've been tightening up the standards. And there are also households who might have family members passing away. That's why the number has grown. And you have never intended to improve the housing problem in PRH, and you just put the blame on these sitting tenants in order to hide the fact that you have not provided enough flats for allocation. That's why you should have stopped this policy of evicting tenants. You should give them back the right to stay in public housing units. Thank you. Next, Mr. Lam Yu-ming. Yes, I agree with what the other gentleman just said. I'm also one of the tenants who have been evicted because my mom passed away because of illness, and as a result, we have been classified as a PUO household. In fact, this is something that every family will have to go through. Sometimes family members would pass away, and there would be change in the size of the household. This is something inevitable. But then, under the existing policy of the administration, you are tightening up the standard all the time. And apparently, you will not take into account the possible change in the foreseeable future in a household. You have also not taken into account the problem encountered by these households. Yes, the administration has been emphasizing that you will have to use public housing resources in a reasonable manner. In the next 3 years, you're going to deal with some 7,600 households that will have whose units will have to be taken out for reallocation. That's the argument put forth by the administration. You're trying to use the resources in a more reasonable manner. But then when compared to the 250,000 households on the waiting list, the number of units for reallocation would be just a drop in the bucket. That can hardly solve the existing problem. So it shows that given the fact that the demand outstrips supply, it shows that the administration does not have any long-term planning in terms of public housing policy. And also for the PUO cases, is that a reasonable standard? So are you trying to increase the number of units for reallocation? And how about the PUO cases? So in 2007, you adopted the standard of 35 square meter, and now you're reducing it to 34, and now it's reduced further to 30 square meters. So apparently you're saying that they do not have to live in such spacious units. In fact, living standard is backtracking all the time. This is really ironic, and this is sparking an outcry in a community, and the tenants are not involved in the formulation of the latest policy. So how did you come up with the latest standards? So we only know that you just worked that out behind closed doors, and it's hardly convincing. And in terms of the under the long-term housing strategy, the administration also talk about the long-term vision. You like to improve the living space per person, and yet you're preaching this, and yet you're doing something differently. And you just do it single-handedly. You just forcibly recover these units. Well, I will also be getting married. I'll also be having children. And yet, even if I can submit a marriage certificate, I will still have to be evicted.
Next, we have Mr. Loon C.Y. from the Community Development Initiative. Thank you. Today, I'd like to talk about the continuity and the logic of the under-occupation policy. The department always emphasizes that we need to make optimal use of public housing resources. but I don't see how the policy regarding under-occupation and the proposed measures can help you make optimal use of public housing resources. The root of the problem is not about how many PUO units there are, but rather you're not building enough PRH units. The trend is, I think I've also said in an article published in the Hong Kong Economic Journal, that over the last 2 or 3 decades, the renovated units in PRH unit in public housing estates has become the major source of supply of PRH units, and that trend would tell us why the housing departments emphasize so much on the efficiency of allocation of PRH units, because you don't have enough units. So they will try to expedite the process while given the constraint that there is the same number of units. According to the Audit Commission's report, we have 470 vacant units. The 10,000 odd vacant units, why is it that they have not been used for deployment? Why do we have these units in the first place? And secondly, a more fundamental question, is it because the rotation doesn't work? The reason we have under occupation households is because some family members may pass away. As the population aging become more and more serious, does the department envisage that the number of such PUO units households will continue to increase? So have you considered the continuity of this policy? Are you going to extend it forever? Do you have a timetable? You cannot extend that policy indefinitely. Right now, the production of PRH units may not be able to catch up with demand. But do you want to, allow this, anomaly to continue? And you, because of your policy failure, you now come. Is it because of that you want to rectify the problem by coming up with this under-occupation policy? But that would result, on the other hand, another mismatch of resources allocation, because you wouldn't be able to come up with new PRH units. The deployment. Right now, you need a large number of small units for a single person household. So how are you going to deal with the problem of this mismatch of resources? So how does the department intend to do in terms of ensuring continuity of its policies? Mr. Chen Ching, well, I also used to live in a block built with defective concrete. In 1996, I moved to a new public housing estate with a space of 400 square meters. In 2007, my parents passed away, my grandparents passed away, and then my siblings got married. I became a single person household and put under the PO list. The housing department said that if you were married, then I wouldn't need to leave, move out of the premises. But in 2013, you tightened it, the standard to 42. So you say you are being, you are prepared to be humanistic. Before I married, I informed the housing department when we're going to marry and where I will be married. But the housing department staff said that wouldn't count. I still have to give you an offer. If you turn it down, I will take it that you refuse our first offer of transfer. You talk about the relocation subsidy. We live in the Harmony blocks. Obviously, we have to spend money, laying the tiles and so on. I was evicted twice. I don't know why. The policy of the housing department is so ridiculous. Have you finished? Yes. Next. Cold-blood citizen? No. The Alliance for Defending Grassroots Housing Rights, Ms. Yim Pik Fan. Good afternoon. I speak on behalf of our alliance because we're very concerned about the welfare of the grassroots living in PRH units. According to our contact with the older Kai Fongs, I think the government, when they wanted to build a new town, because and demolish all the squatter huts and move the people to the so-called new towns. The Kai Fongs at the time accepted this because we're told that the squatters were very dangerous. They were very simple people. They thought that once they moved into these PRH units, they thought that it was like living in squatter huts. The whole family could stay together. That's how they thought. And when they moved to a new town, the PRH unit in a new town, they found out that there are restrictions in terms of the size of the flat, and they need to be registered and so on. And because of that, originally they were a large family, and as a result, they became a smaller family, and they have this tradition belief that several generations of the same family could live together, and that would be a blessing. But when they realized that in PRH units this would not be possible because we have this tenancy policy. The same is true for the villagers living in Northeast NT. They thought that they could live, several generations of the same family could live in there for forever. But so the Kai Fongs thought that they could continue to live in these units. They never had imagined that because of the well-off tenant policy and the under-occupation tenancy, they will have to, be separate from the children. I think the households classified as PEO units do not deliberately want to take up additional space. For the Kai Fongs who live in these units, they live in these units because they may need to take care of the family members who are sick or disabled or old in age, and at the same time they have sacrificed some opportunities to be to buy an HRS unit or acquire private property in the market. They've given up so much because they want to look after the family or to maintain the integrity of the family. So to some extent, they're helping us ensure that the senior members of the family can retire in situ. Next, we have Mr. Cheung Tak Kong from Chairman. I am one of the tenants who have been evicted from the PRH units, and I can remember, I think all the government departments are the same, like the Home Affairs Department. The Housing Department. Sometimes the road is very smooth, the road surface, and all of a sudden they would simply dig it up, and the road become very and create traffic congestion. And after the road has just been repaired, they dig it up again. It's like the Housing Department. You have a very sound family, and because the parents have passed away, and a single member of the household is left, and then the person becomes an under-occupation household. At this time, when a person does not deliberately want to occupy more space than warranted, but he may want to live with his parents, and because his parents have passed away. But during this time, we're talking about a transitional period. Person could still be in grief because his parents have passed away, and yet he would be forced to be transferred to a smaller unit by the Housing Department. And during this period of time, perhaps I'll talk about something else. The Deputy Director told us just now that they have arrangements for the under-occupation households. Let's say they live in a flat that is larger than what is warranted, and they will be transferred to a smaller unit. I think for a normal person, I mean, they will eventually, have children. If we allocate a small unit to the person, and in future, if he gets married and have children, he will become an overcrowded household. Why don't you then, when you identify him as a PUO, household, why did you ask the doctor to test to certify whether he is virile, and if he cannot have the ability to produce children, then you can allocate a small unit to him. That would be best. I think your time is up. Next, Miss Anna Zhang. Yes, my name is Anna Zhang. And if I may now start. The Housing Department always tell the public that the public housing policy is both reasonable and rational. The Housing Department is now forcing people, the PUO households, to move to smaller units. Is that being reasonable and humanistic? If we compare with the housing policy of Hong Kong and the UK, you can see a sharp contrast and how ridiculous the way we deal with the so-called under-occupation households. In Hong Kong, in dealing with the problem of under-occupation, actually this is one of the ways for the government to shift the focus. We know that there is insufficient supply of PRH units because the Housing Department is not building public housing units, and there's a shortfall. But the government is, changing the focus and smear put the blame on the PEO households, creating social division in order to resolve the problem. Let's see how CI Leung define PEOs. In Hong Kong, I think the PEO is determined by the size of the unit. I think you have to consider whether or not, or should you just set an area you consider appropriate and say this unit is suitable for the tenant. But I think one should take into consideration a person's psychological and physiological needs to determine how much a person needs, and the area will not be the standard. But rather they know that each person should have his own personal space, and that is why a single person should have a single bedroom before the premises is considered a suitable living environment in the UK. And in Hong Kong, eviction or forcible transfer is the only solution. In the UK, transfer or relocation is one of the options. The major measure they adopt is that they will cut down on your housing allowance, but we don't have this in Hong Kong. Another thing is that in the UK they allow people to add new members to the household. It could be even if you were to have a tenant joining you, that would be allowed. Whereas in Hong Kong, there is only forcible eviction or transfer. Has the housing authority respect the sentiment of people? Do you regard the tenants as a commodity? I think people's feelings should be respected. The government has. I think I understand that people don't want to remove in the UK, but in Hong Kong we do not do that. Talking about the senior citizens, I think for those age 60 to 69, they are put at the back of the queue. But in the UK, they would, base the criteria on the age at which a person retire. So please do not shift the focus. Treat the tenants as a commodity, and also reconsider how you can be rational and also humanistic at the same time. I'd like to remind those in the public gallery not to disturb the proceedings of this hearing. Next, we have Ms. Lee Shi Lin, living alone in Sultan Concerned Group. I'd like to explain the reason why the Concerned Group was set up, because we do not agree that the government is wasting public funds, so we wrote So I asked for to be transferred to a one-person household in the Southern District, but they have not make preparation. They will allow a man and woman to be moved in a single unit.
This is ridiculous. I've written to the housing department, and then the reply was that there were only 4 units available for singletons. So I'd just like to know, well, if there were only 4 units available, what measures were taken by the department to tackle the problem? Well, the housing authority already wrote to a number of 1P tenants, so they would have to be transferred to a smaller unit. So how many people have been affected? So other than the shortage of units in the Southern District for singletons, there are other housing estates. One is Tin Wan, and the other is Wah Kwai. Another one is Shepai Wan estate, and there was a UO household. He said that he would like to go to Ma Wan, but then he was told that no such unit was available in Ma Wan. That's why he had to wait a bit longer. So if there was no unit available, then he would have to wait for other offers, and then after 3 offers have been made, then he would have to be evicted. So I think the department is doing this as if it's going through the motion. And then for the households that are going to increase in size, and if they have to move to a smaller unit, it's just a waste of time and resources. And it's not just the Southern District that is short of smaller units. In fact, in other districts, they are suffering very much the same problem. So the housing department will have to review this outdated policy on UO households. And in the course of working on it, we also noticed that there is an administrative problem. That is, initially, when this was implemented, tenants or households with elderly members over 70 were also given this letter. I think it's a waste of public money, because the elderly tenants would be very anxious about this, because once they receive this letter, they would be worried that they would be evicted or transferred forcibly by the housing department, and that's totally unwarranted. And also, this policy has not taken into account the humanistic concerns. And has the department looked at Section 19 of the Housing Ordinance in recovering these units? Thank you. Next, Mr. Chow Kem Wah from the Kwai Lun Estate Concern Group. Well, the so-called UO policy, well, I was one of the tenants being forcibly transferred because of this policy. Well, for the residents who have been defined as UO households, many of them have become UO households because of a change in the household size. And yet all these UO households, before they were defined as UO households, has the department told us what they have done before these households have become UO households? We have met with members of the HA on this policy. Most of them were not aware of the fact that the HD hid many facts from them, and they were not very clear about the policy, and they just blindly formulated the policy without knowing the whole truth. And as a result, many tenants had been persecuted or been forcibly transferred. Well, for those households who have been defined UO households, and if the housing department feels that they have abused public housing resources, how come before they were allocated a flat, after they have been allocated this flat, well, how come the policy has been tightened up over the years? And as a result, the standard has become tighter. So initially, they might not have been UO households, and now they have become UO households, and every family will go through this process whereby family members might pass away. And yet many members might not have looked into these family circumstances before they supported the policy, which have caused unnecessary disturbance to the households concerned. So for members who are involved in formulating the policy, I hope that they would look into the circumstances of these tenants before they formulate such policies which might cause a lot of inconvenience and hardship to these households. They have been staying in these units for a long time, and after a family member has passed away, if they have to be forcibly transferred, that would only add to their hardship. Next, Ms. Yang Wing-chi, a representative from a concerned group on public housing removal. So why have these UO households become scapegoats? Under this policy, many people have to be forcibly transferred. That's because of the uneven distribution of resources. We have the Highland Premium policy and also the housing led policy. Well, many of the land resources have been given to the major developers, but then the developers have been subsidized by government with various policies. For example, they can build infrastructure facilities and also the transport infrastructure policy. And also, if you look at the tax rate, we are one of the lowest in different economies, and therefore these major consortiums have made the largest profit, and yet public housing tenants have to struggle with one another. And in fact, these conglomerates have been monopolizing the rare resources. This is grossly unfair. That's why we have to resist this policy of forcing these tenants to move to smaller units. Yes, in the name of more evenly distributing housing resources. But then, who has to be blamed? CY Leung has been depriving people of their personal space, and even their right to protect their own family has been deprived. Yes, they have promised that they would be building more units, and yet we have 240,000 people on the waiting list, and there is also a lot of idle land in the urban area, and you're actually handing over many of these sites to the major developers. Obviously, these are transfer of benefits to the developers, and yet the administration has not dealt with these problems. And yet you are putting the blame on these tenants, and they have been forcibly transferred. And for people who have no power and resources or clout, you're actually putting more pressure to bear on them. All right, CY Leung is saying that, well, all right, he cannot meet the demand by anti-Northeast residents for not moving and not demolishing their homes. But then we are talking about over 600 hectares of land in northeast NT, and yet only 6% would be used for public housing development, and yet you are forcing these people to move. So however many new sites are being developed, you're not going to meet the needs, and you cannot just give the instruction and order people to leave. These are their homes, these are their roots. So I'd like to ask the senior officials and LegCo members here, all right, you're staying in luxurious flats in mid-levels and so on. How about people losing their homes? Do you understand their sentiments? So I hope that you can withdraw this policy. You can withdraw the initiative on anti-Northeast. You should also withdraw the White Elephant project. Well, anti-Northeast has nothing to do with this. Well, if you do not do anything about it, we'll put up more resistance. Once again, I'd like to say that anti-Northeast is not the subject under discussion. It has nothing to do with the UO policy. That's why I hope that for deputations who have yet to speak, please focus on the subject under discussion. Next, Ms. Wong Hiu Kwan, Neighborhood and Workers Service Center. All right, UO household is not a big problem. That's why the housing department does not have to take any action to resolve this problem. When your family member passes away, then the only thing that you should be saying is that you have my condolences, and you should not be forcing people out. So this is not a problem at all. And what we have to face is, therefore, the administration and different departments are working together to forcibly transfer these workers and tenants, including the Urban Renewal Authority. All right, after the wedding card streets, you're actually putting up new flats so that you can put them up for sale. And then for the housing department, you're not going to introduce rent control. And then for tenants in private flats, they are subject to rent increase, and instead of being able to stay in Shem Shui Po, I have to move to elsewhere. And also for Choi Yun village, the tenants or the villagers have to be transferred, or they have to move elsewhere. So this is a housing problem that many of us are facing. This is the most serious problem, and yet you are diverting our attention. You're talking about the effective and efficient use of public housing resources. You're totally shameless, because this is a major social issue, and you are turning it into the problem of a few. And these are families who have had family members passing away, and yet you're putting the blame on them. This is totally shameless. And it all boils down to this. All right, for couples, all right, they've worked very hard for several decades, and now one of them passes away, and you're forcing the remaining one or the surviving spouse to go elsewhere. All right, they have been there for several decades. So why would they want to leave? All right, they've worked very hard for their whole life, and now they and their children have to move elsewhere. Of course, they will resist it. So it's a question of the good deeds that and the bad deeds you have done. So you're actually forcing people to rebel against you, because as humans, how can you be so inhuman? When a family member passes away, you're actually forcing them to move. Well, public housing is a relatively stable housing resources, and yet if you force people to move, then you're actually forcing people to turn against you. That's why many people will have to take to the streets on July the 1st. That's why you will have to withdraw this policy, because this is a totally inhuman policy. This is a draconian policy. Next, Mr. Aulak Pang from the Kwai Fong Workers Group. Well, Chairman, just now you repeatedly said that this has nothing to do with the anti-Northeast problem. But then you're developing anti-Northeast because you claim that you're resolving housing problem. In fact, for this UO policy, it has a lot to do with the Northeast anti-policy. That's because the administration has land, and yet it has refused to use it for public housing development. Every year, the administration has set aside land for hotels and international schools. In fact, at best, they are just adding to the affluence of a society, and yet for the grassroots, you're actually forcibly moving them out. You're talking about tens of thousands of the so-called UO households and several thousand anti-Northeast villages, and there are similarities between the two. I think this is totally ridiculous. You're actually forcing people to leave their homeland and the community that they stay in, and you're actually forcing them to leave their original lifestyle. All right, I'm working on this job, and then I might be spending 15 minutes in terms of traveling, and yet after I have moved, it might take me an hour on traveling before I can go to work, and then I have to work long hours already. Well, these days, many people have to work 14 hours a day, and then for elderly family member, they will also have to go to the outpatient clinic and so on. So you're affecting people's lifestyle, you're affecting people's life, and the entire family will have difficulty adjusting or adapting to the new environment.
Some petitions ask whether or not the government could provide for more assistance to the affected tenants. But if you do that, again, resources would be required. So I don't know how you're able to save resources. And thirdly, and more importantly, I think the government's intention is really evil. They want to stir up conflict among the grassroots people, and I think this is really malicious. And it's not only shameless, because the crux of the problem is that there are sufficient resources which can satisfy the housing needs of the people, but the government is silent about that. They don't satisfy the demand. On the other hand, they would label all the PUO households saying that they are abusing public resources, and again and again they are smearing these people. What is most important, I think, is that we should withdraw the policy on under occupation, withdraw the proposal to develop North NT, and the government should try its best to satisfy the housing demand of the residents. Next, Ms. Chow Shit Yin, lacking in lit concern group. First of all, I'd like to ask a question about the government, which needs to be, reasonable and rational. So long as the Kai Fongs are, I think the point is that I think someone's family member has passed away, and then you issue a letter forcing them to be transferred. So how can you claim that you are being humanistic? Secondly, the same question asked previously. According to Article 17 of the Housing Ordinance, has the Housing Authority been authorized to recover the premises? Even if you cannot enforce Section 22, the tenants do not have the ability to move out. Can the Housing Authority, pursuant to Section 19 of the Housing Ordinance, be authorized to recover the units? And that question has yet to be answered now. And I'd like to urge the Housing Panel to seek legal advice as to please look into Section 19 of the Housing Ordinance, which is a time bomb. And thirdly, the OU units are competing for units with the 1 to 2 person households. So how can we avoid this, this clash or conflict? Next, this is the Housing Panel. I don't understand why the discussion cannot be linked with the development of North NT. The development you are now talking about is building PRH units. Please do not create this, don't say that if we do not develop North NT, there will not be public housing units. I think the actual outcome now is that government has a lot of land which is refusing to use, and is deliberately telling the public that we don't have enough land to build public housing. You won't even get your PRH units in 3 years' time. And then you're telling the public that there's plenty of land in North NT, so long as we can develop North NT. Please come back to the question of under occupation. I think it's the same. Under occupation and North NT is the same. To conclude, I would like to ask the government to withdraw all the policies which actually, including the policy on the under occupation, urban renewal, North NT, because they are all, hurting the interests of the people. Next, Mr. Chen Ka-wing from No Flat Slaves. I heard many deputations saying that the policy regarding under occupation has affected the single person applicants on the waiting list. Many deputations have already talked about this, and I'm grateful that they are not easily affected by the divisive policy of the Housing Department. Given the poor living environment in Hong Kong, for someone to lease a unit in the private market, to lease a private premises the size of one singleton unit, PRH unit, most typical young person in Hong Kong will not be able to afford that. So I hope the Housing Department will really reflect on this. You come with all these proposals, screening the few thousand people and so on. You are actually hiding the fact, and it would not help, solve the problem of housing shortage. Regarding the under occupation households, given that we have such a long waiting list, we're talking about 250,000, the government should massively build new PRH units to respond to the needs of the public. But what we are now seeing is that for the next 5 years, it is forecasted that every year that the annual production is only 16,000, which is slightly more than the 15,000 built by the previous administration every year. At the same time, a large amount of land is being sold to the property developer. So the average citizen simply cannot afford to buy those luxury apartments. So regarding the question of insufficient PRH supply, the government is not trying to find a solution, but rather is trying to make use of the measures to tackle under occupation in order to squeeze some extra, vacant PRH units. But actually, we're talking about one PRH units for swapping for another PRH units. So the different aspects of the housing policy are interrelated. You cannot just focus on the policy regarding under occupation and ignore, for example, the policy for well-off tenants. For many households, after the children finish with their studies and take up employment, they are making a contribution to our society. I'm sorry your time is up. I'd like to thank all the deputations for coming to express the views. And now I'd like to first invite the administration to respond before we open the floor for members to ask questions. I'd like to thank all the deputations for the valuable views. We've heard all the points that you've raised. We fully understand that nobody wants to be moved out of the unit in which they live, or be moved away out of, forced to leave the environment that they're familiar with. So if you ask whether there's room for improvement, obviously there is. But I must reiterate that this policy is really necessary. We need to continue to enforce this policy because, for various reasons, our goalpost has never been changed regarding under occupation. I've said this before and I'll explain again. Since 1992, we've already set a standard for under occupation. For one-person household, it shouldn't be more than 25 square meters, two-person, 35 square meters, and so on. So that policy has been in place all along, and we've never changed that at all. Please, with the deputation, please keep quiet. It's not yet your turn. Except that for the most serious cases, that is a few years ago, for households taking more than 35, 34 square meters per person, we'll deal with those cases first. And this is logical. I wouldn't start with 25 square meters. And we're not changing the goalposts. After I've done with the 34, 35 square meters, I'll gradually move downwards. But for the Housing Authority, over the last 3 years, in dealing with households taking up more than 30 square meters per capita, is still a big far away from the 25 square meters. Our difficulty is that if we were to allocate PRH units to those on waiting list, we're only allocating 25 square meters. And we're now proposing to deal with households who are occupying 35 square kilometers per capita. What we want to do is simply have equal and fair distribution resources. And another point is that the number of under occupation households are increasing in number. I'm using a yardstick of 25 square meters per person. That has never changed. We now have more than 50,000 so-called under occupation households. It's not a question of one large unit in exchange for a small unit. While the number of units may stay the same, but for a PUO unit, it can accommodate 4 persons. So overall speaking, we can allow more people to live in PRH units. So for those on the waiting list, among the 120,000, half of them are 3 to 4 person households. So we see that there is an urgent problem here, and we need to help those on the waiting list to be allocated a unit as soon as possible. I shall repeat the point about having to be humanistic. If the circumstances warrant, the Housing Authority will try its best to help the tenants. But some deputations, according to some after hearing deputations, I hope you not have the misunderstanding that at your time of difficulty, you don't really need to move out. But it doesn't mean that in the long term you will never need to be transferred. because we want to ensure that there is an even or fair distribution of public housing resources. We agree that we need to increase the production of public housing units, and the Housing Authority has undertaken that we'll do this full steam ahead, but in the process, it doesn't mean that our other resources will not need to be properly deployed. Would anyone else would like to supplement? Mr. Leung Sai-chi. Chairman, I think we must understand that when we allocate new units, the largest would be at the most generous. We allocate only 20 square meters per person, but the PUO units houses we're talking about is 35. That is already much larger than the most lenient allocation we provide now to those on the waiting list. The PUO households, the numbers are increasing every year. I think we should understand that the problems has to be, we cannot afford not to resolve the problem. Many people said that after the under occupation households vacate the premises, they will need to move to another unit, and then another applicant will move in. It's a one-for-one swap and doesn't help resolve the problem. That's not really the case. For most of the PUO households, they are occupying 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom units, and these flats actually can accommodate 3 to 4 or even 4 to 6 persons. So for these units, they can accommodate much greater number of people, and that also can help us have a more rational, use of public housing resources. Are there any members who would like to speak? Mr. Alan Leung, Port Chair, and Mr. Leung Yiu Chung. We're scheduled to finish at 5:30, and I'd like to propose that we extend our meeting by 15 minutes. We have 3 members who would like to speak, so may I propose 4 minutes each? Alan Leung, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Deputations for coming here to give us your views. And I always want to ask this question, that is, the Housing Authority, how does it deal with situations like this? I'm sure the Chairman has also come across many such cases. A household may be an under occupation unit, but one of its members is already married to someone from living in the mainland who is due to come soon, and he's been told that his spouse will be arriving in a few months' time, but the housing department would not allow him to wait and force him to move out of the premises, and when the spouse arrives in Hong Kong, he will have to apply for transfer again. Another category would be cases where the person lived with his parents, and when the parents pass away, he become, a PUO household. Of course, he would be in grief at the time because his parents have just passed away, and we've heard of such cases where these people are encountering difficulties during this time. Actually, I've dealt with such cases in my constituency as well. The housing department would indeed try to look after these people, but in some other cases, it doesn't seem to be so. So I wonder whether, I think in order to avoid all these disputes and in order that the Kai Fongs will not have to suffer from such anxieties, can you institutionalize the way you deal with these cases? That is, when a household have these problems, they will be given certain accommodation. Just now, Mr. Lee also told us that for the under occupation households, there could be one person living in a 2-bedroom flat or unit. If you ask him to move out, he would be transferred to a one-person PRH unit. And we all know that for those those are not senior citizens, but even those who are senior citizens on the waiting list, they have to wait for a long time. If you move these, under occupation households from the larger units, and they have to be offered a one-person unit, as a result, the queue applying for one-person unit will have to wait longer.
3 questions, Mr. Lee. I'll answer the third question first because that has been asked repeatedly by the deputations. So for the non-elderly applicants allocation policy, every year we do have this outline plan, and we have our own criteria as to how many such units should be made available for allocation. And after meeting that demand, in fact, we also have people on the waiting list. We also have redevelopment cases and so on. So every year we are talking about tens of thousands of such allocation cases. And then for the UO cases, they would only take up a certain percentage. So every year we have to meet the non-singleton elderly applicants. And as I said, for the waiting list for general households, about half of them, some 60,000 of these households are 3 to 4P families. That's why every year we have to meet the needs of different categories of applicants in order to in our allocation. How about the first 2 questions? Yes, indeed, we do have some internal guidelines, but then for every single case, there are some minor differences. That's why the staff concerned will have to exercise their discretion in dealing with such cases. But then for the 2 cases referred to by Mr. Leung, well, almost invariably, we would delay the process. For example, if you have a wife on the mainland, then you will have to give us proof. So we do have difficulty if you're still in the process of application. But then if there is sufficient evidence to show that your wife will be coming shortly, let's say within the next 6 months, then we will not be asking you to leave right away. All right. If there are family members passing away, all right, the household size might have reduced. So will there be a transitional period? For example, would there be a norm? Say 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and so on. So will there be a transitional period before which you would not be forcibly transferring people? Yes? Mr. Choi? Mr. Xu? Well, for families in which a family member just passed away, well, we will be looking at the circumstances of the family and see how it has affected the surviving family members. We have encountered cases whereby the surviving members might have emotional problems. So for the surviving members, the impact might vary. So we would wait till the emotional state of the surviving member has stabilized. So if there is medical certificate to show that he is not suitable for removal yet, then we will be prepared to wait. So there is no general rule as to how long you will be prepared to waive that. Well, usually there would be a 6-month grace period before we assess the case again. I hope that you will bring this back to the authority for a review. Well, for 6 months for a family where a family member has just passed away, is it excessively short? So I would think that it's excessively short for a family member who has just passed away. Well, for the memberly concerned, it has already brought a lot of hardship. And if you require them to move in 6 months, then it's a bit too harsh to them. So I think you should review the policy. Please do think about it. Yes, Mr. Paul Chair. Well, the subject under discussion today, Chairman, that has brought me back to the years when we were brought up. Well, I was brought up in Seoul Oak Estate, and it's a flat of about 300 square feet, and 7 of us stayed in that flat. And of course, time has changed, and given that the resources are limited, of course, we will have to use our resources very wisely. And I understand that in the past, the housing department would be more prepared to exercise its discretion. But then with the audit report looming, the room for you to exercise your discretion would be limited. Well, I understand that there are some families in which their family members might have passed away, and as a result, they might become UO households, and they will have to be forcibly transferred. So in what circumstances would you be able to exercise your discretion? Where there are family members who have passed away, or where there are family members coming for reunion, and so on. So if you can make it more transparent as to the circumstances under which you can exercise your discretion, then people will be more able to understand your policy. Well, even if they fail to understand your position, well, at least when we try to help these people, there will be more room for us to maneuver. Yes, Mr. Albert Lee. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your question. As I just said, in many cases, we have adopted a very humanistic approach. But then for different people, they might have different interpretation. Well, for people with economic hardship, or people who are getting married very shortly with additional family member, or within a very short period of time, there would be family member coming for reunion, or people who would be buying a flat shortly, or people who have purchased secondary home ownership scheme flats, and also for families with family members passing away, or even for families with a sick member. Well, when they are in hardship already, well, if we ask them to move at this juncture, that might be very difficult. That's why we'll be more than happy to help. That's why we do have internal guidelines. Well, a maximum of 6 months will be offered, and then we will have to review the case. Well, it's not your turn to speak yet, so please do not interrupt. We have to maintain the order of the meeting. Well, before the chairman asks you to speak, you are not supposed to speak. So that is the order of the meeting that you will have to observe. All right. So we will defer the case by 6 months, but then after 6 months, we'll review the case again, because as members are aware, in different cases, there are different circumstances. So even if the same factor might feature, that will have to be considered on a case-by-case basis. Chairman, 6 months, would it be too short a period? All right. How many 6 months can there be? So would there be clear guidelines? And also, other than the factors that you've just cited, for example, well, if they have been misled by housing department staff, depending on the circumstances, for example, they might have been transferred as a result of the defective concrete case. Would that also be one of the compassionate grounds to be considered? All right, as I said, that the case will be reviewed after 6 months, and then we will have to decide after the review. That's why that will have to be decided on a case-by-case basis. I cannot say for sure that another 6 months will be granted after this first 6 months. That will depend on the circumstances, and also for the redevelopment or defective concrete case and so on. Well, earlier on, the chairman already invited the housing authority to reconsider this. So for the time being, I don't have anything to add, because at an earlier session, I already said that there were many cases involving defective concrete cases, so the households already had to move once because of the defective concrete blocks. So I've asked them to go back and give it more thoughts because many households have been affected. Yes, I was here at both sessions. So what I'd like to know is you have not been exercising your discretionary power based on that, and you will have to consider it again. Yes, under the current policy, irrespective of the reason why they have been allocated this flat, and after they've moved in, they will be treated on a par, whether or not it's about the scoring point system or whatever. So under the existing policy, all the households will be considered on an equal footing. All right, you talk about being reasonable and rational. All right, you said that all the cases will be considered on a case-by-case basis. I think that is precisely the problem. There is no set rule as to how a case will be dealt with. All right, for your colleagues working in the estates, including the property management company, they would not be exercising such discretion. Well, so long as the time is up, you will have to move out, and there is no discretion whatsoever. That's the problem. As many tenants have said, all right, when they try to talk to the staff there, nobody would be willing to talk. So as soon as the time's up, they will be asked to leave. Well, on the face of it, it sounds very nice, but then when it comes to actual implementation, it's an entirely different story. You said that, well, in some cases, a singleton is occupying a 2P flat, and as a result, there are many people on the waiting list and their housing condition or environment cannot be improved. But then for people on the waiting list, about half of them are singleton applicants. And when compared to those existing households, well, for the 2P households, you're telling them that the waiting time would be for 3 years. But then for the singleton applicants, they have nothing to look forward to. There is no pledge as to how long they would have to wait. All right, for university students, you said that many of them have just put in their applications just in case. Even if that is the case, there might have been an inflated demand. But for how long do they have to wait? Are you able to tell us the average waiting time? 5-6 years would be the minimum waiting time. And now you are pitching them against you're pitching these UO cases against the singleton applicants on the waiting list. We are talking about over 100,000 applicants on the waiting list who are singleton applicants. So if they are both competing for the same units, then what is going to happen? I think this is also unfair, because you are trying to cover up the situation with regard to singleton applicants on the waiting list. You have avoided touching on the issue. So can you tell us, for the singleton applicants on the waiting list, for how long do they have to wait on average before they are allocated a flat? Well, Chairman, I'd like to focus on the issue of under-occupied households. I do not have the figures with regard to singleton applicants on the waiting list. We also have the waiting list guidelines, so we have to follow the guidelines. But then we have heard the views from members. So for different housing estates, if there have been inconsistent approaches, then we'll review it.
Chairman, I was also talking about the under-occupation households. You keep criticizing them for taking up more public resources than what is warranted, and as a result, people on the waiting list cannot move into PRH units. You were saying that the 3 to 4 person household, they are not, the chances of being allocated PRH units is being restricted because of under occupation. Chairman, earlier I've already said that we have an allocation plan every year. According to that plan, for different categories of applicants, we'll try our best to strike a balance. And that's exactly the reason. Chairman, this is exactly the problem we need to resolve. For the singleton applicant, they have to wait indefinitely. They are not the group which will be offered PRH units within 3 years, and that is not fair. I hope the department will take the views of members back to the authority for consideration. I've already highlighted all the issues raised during the first and second session. Please take them back to the Housing Authority, and you can, respond to those views in writing to us. We've already overrun today, so I'll have to therefore declare that we have the adjourned meeting now. Thank you.